Somewhere in Japan tonight, a single cow is standing in a stall worth more than most people's cars. By the time a piece of that animal reaches a plate, 1 pound of it can sell for $200. We're going to follow this animal's whole path, through 18 centuries of history, a bloodline guarded more carefully than royalty, a diet almost no other cattle on Earth receive, a genetics theft that changed Japanese law, and an auction floor where 1 bull can sell for more than $3 million. If journeys like that pull you in, stay a moment and hit subscribe before we start walking this one. Wagyu isn't a single breed, it's 4: Japanese black, Japanese brown, Japanese shorthorn, and Japanese polled. Japanese black alone makes up roughly 90% of all Wagyu raised in the country, and Japan treats the whole group as something closer to a national treasure than livestock. Getting to that status took nearly 2,000 years, and it started with an animal nobody was allowed to eat. Long before Wagyu meant dinner, it meant a day's work in the mud. Cattle first arrived in Japan from northern China around 200 AD, and for most of the next 17 centuries, nobody in the country was legally allowed to eat one. In 675 AD, Emperor Tenmu banned the consumption of cattle, horses, dogs, monkeys, and chickens, a decree rooted in Buddhist teaching and Shinto ideas about purity. That ban held, in one form or another, for almost 1,200 years. Through all of that time, the ancestors of today's Wagyu earned their keep hauling carts, plowing rice paddies on steep mountain terrain, and pulling timber valued for strength and a calm temperament, not for the meat under their hide. A farmer in those centuries judging one of these animals was looking at a coworker, not a future meal. In 1872, Emperor Meiji sat down and ate beef in public, ending the ban as part of a deliberate push to modernize the country. Between 1868 and 1887, roughly 2,600 foreign cattle were imported and crossed into the native herd, and different regions of Japan chased different ideals of what a good cow should be. Some of them, for the first time in the breed's history, started breeding for fat. And 3 of those regions ended up producing the beef the world knows today. Those 3 regions never agreed on what made the best cow, and they still don't. Kobe beef comes from Tajima-Gyu cattle, born and raised in Hyogo Prefecture, prized for a texture so soft it's often compared to butter, and traditionally served as steak, where a hot pan lets its clean, buttery marbling speak for itself. Matsusaka beef comes from virgin female cattle raised in the Matsusaka region of Mie Prefecture, known for unusually rich, deep fat, and a nickname that comes up constantly: the Queen of Beef. Tied to old farm traditions of hand-feeding and grooming individual animals, almost like family. It's usually cooked as sukiyaki, thin slices simmered briefly in a sweet soy broth that can carry its heavier fat. Omi beef from Shiga Prefecture is the oldest of the 3 by far, with a documented history stretching back more than 400 years. Its fat is lighter and cleaner, delicate enough to soften at body temperature, which is why it's traditionally served shabu-shabu style, swished for seconds in hot water with no pan at all. 3 regions, 3 separate reputations, and Japanese diners argue about the ranking the way Americans argue about barbecue styles. A plate of any of the 3 rarely comes in a large portion. Because the fat is so rich, a few thin slices are considered a full serving, and chefs plan menus around that restraint rather than around volume. Underneath all 3 brands sits the same kind of paperwork. Every Wagyu calf is given a nose print at birth, unique to that animal the way a fingerprint is unique to a person. Breeders track lineage for generations, recording which bull sired which cow, going back further than most family trees. A newborn calf in rural Japan can carry a documented genetic record longer than most people's family history. And buyers study those papers before they study the animal standing in front of them. That record doesn't end at the farm gate. Even after slaughter, the meat carries a certificate tracing it back to one named, numbered animal, not just a breed or a region. Modern breeders back all of that paperwork with lab science too. Blood and tissue samples are DNA tested to confirm parentage before a calf is ever officially registered. The same kind of test used to settle a human paternity question, run instead on cattle worth tens of thousands of dollars apiece. Regional breeding cooperatives keep their own local registries on top of the national one, so a Tajima-Gyu calf in Hyogo is cross-checked against records held both by its own prefecture and by the wider Wagyu registry covering the whole country. which is part of why a false pedigree is almost impossible to fake for long. Feeding that bloodline properly takes far longer than raising an ordinary cow. A standard beef steer reaches slaughter weight in about 18 months. A Wagyu steer stays on the farm closer to 900 days, nearly 3 years, on a carefully managed grain diet built to grow fat inside the muscle fiber rather than around it. The ration itself usually centers on corn and barley, sometimes mixed with wheat bran and rice straw for fiber, adjusted in stages as the animal ages, so the fat builds gradually instead of all at once. That gradual pace isn't optional. The kind of fat Wagyu is known for, marbling threaded inside the muscle itself, develops slowly, at a biological pace no amount of extra grain can speed past. Which is exactly why shortening the timeline produces a fatter cow, but not a genuinely marbled one. Farmers track feed by the kilogram and weight gain week by week, and that extra time on a grain ration is most of what drives the final price, before the animal ever reaches an auction. 3 years is roughly how long it takes a person to finish a college degree. And that's the stretch of time one animal spends being fed, weighed, and watched before it's considered ready. All of that patience is aimed at a single outcome: marbling, the fine white lines of fat threaded through the muscle that most commercial cattle never develop. This is also where the most famous Wagyu story gets complicated. Somewhere along the way, the idea spread that Wagyu cattle in general get daily massages and drink beer to stay relaxed. That story didn't come from nowhere. It grew out of Matsusaka's own tradition and marketing, the same one behind its Queen of Beef nickname, where some farms really did brush, hand feed, and pamper individual cows as part of the region's identity. But even in Matsusaka, that's closer to folklore and branding than a daily chore. And across the wider Wagyu world, it was never standard practice. What actually builds the marbling in Kobe, Omi, and everywhere else is genetics, the grain ration, and a calm, low-stress environment. The real secret was never the massage. It's 3 years of feeding sitting on top of a bloodline that took generations to build. What that patience produces is fat that behaves differently from almost anything else in a meat case. And none of it is judged by eye alone. Japan grades beef on a marbling scale called BMS, running from 1 to 12. The top consumer grade, a 5, requires a BMS of at least 8. Certified Kobe beef has its own tighter bar on top of that, a BMS of 6 or higher, a carcass weight between roughly 260 and 470 kilograms, and a meat quality score of 4 or 5. Only about 3,000 to 5,000 cattle a year meet every part of that standard, out of Japan's entire Wagyu herd. Wagyu fat also carries an unusually high share of oleic acid, the same fat found in olive oil, making up over half of its total fat content. That changes its melting point. Wagyu fat softens at around 25 degrees Celsius, well below the human body's own 37 degrees. A thin slice can start to soften against warm fingers before it ever touches a hot pan. It isn't a cooking trick, it's chemistry, built over 3 years, one animal at a time. None of those numbers are self-reported either. There's an actual physical inspection behind every grade. After slaughter, each carcass is split down the middle and hung up, and inspectors cut a small section, roughly 4 to 5 centimeters, out of the ribeye area between the 6th and 7th rib. Graders don't just eyeball that cross-section. They compare it against a standardized set of reference photographs, matching the exact pattern of white fat against a numbered card, the way a paint store matches a color swatch, which is part of why 2 different graders in 2 different prefectures can agree on the same number. That single cross-section decides the yield grade, marked A, B, or C, based on how much usable meat the carcass produces, and the quality grade, scored 1 to 5, covering marbling, color, brightness, texture, and the quality of the fat itself. Once a carcass passes, it gets a 10-digit identification number tied permanently to that one animal, and a chrysanthemum seal, the official flower of Hyogo Prefecture, stamped onto each major cut. That whole process happens in a few minutes on a slaughterhouse floor, and it's the only thing standing between 3 years of careful feeding and a label that can legally say Kobe. That same chemistry is also why Wagyu producers push back hard against the idea that this much fat has to be unhealthy. Oleic acid is linked in nutrition research to lower LDL cholesterol, the kind associated with heart disease, and higher HDL, the kind that helps clear it. About 40% of Wagyu saturated fat is a specific type called stearic acid, which several studies suggest has little effect on cholesterol at all, unlike the saturated fat in most other cuts of beef. None of that makes a marbled steak a health food, but it does mean the fat running through this animal isn't chemically identical to the fat on a regular grocery store steak. All of that care and all of that value comes together on the auction floor, where the price of this patience gets set in public. Buyers walk the pens beforehand, checking each animal's paperwork and physical condition before a single bid is placed, since by the time the gavel falls, they're committing to a price based as much on a family tree as on the cow standing in front of them. The buyers themselves are rarely private individuals. Most bids come from meat wholesalers, hotel groups, and trading companies buying on behalf of restaurants, all competing for a limited supply that never grows fast enough to meet demand, since nothing about a 3-year animal can be rushed to market when prices spike. At Japan's 2025 Wagyu World Auction in Himeji, one award-winning A5 carcass sold for more than 5 times the average Tokyo market price, bought by a US buyer who had flown in specifically for the sale. A single live Wagyu cow can fetch up to $30,000 at auction before it's even slaughtered. And once that same animal becomes meat, certified Kobe or top-grade A5 can retail for as much as $200 a pound at a butcher's counter overseas. For the price of one Wagyu cow, a person could buy a used car and still walk away with thousands left over. The record for a single animal goes far past that. In 2019, a bull named Mansour reportedly sold at a Japanese auction for $3.1 million, a price built entirely on the genetics he could pass down, rather than on his meat. Even a bull's genetics alone can break records without the animal ever changing hands. At an Australian Wagyu sale, a 2-straw semen package from an elite carcass trait bull sold for $68,000 a straw. $136,000 for the pair, bought sight unseen by an American buyer, purely for the DNA inside 2 small vials. A bloodline worth that kind of money doesn't stay secret by accident, and in 2018, Japan found out exactly what people were willing to risk to get it. That year, Japanese police arrested a restaurant owner and 2 associates for smuggling fertilized Wagyu eggs and semen out of the country in a small metal container, packed for a ship bound for Shanghai, without ever going through the required animal quarantine inspection. China's own beef market had been growing fast for years, and breeding premium Wagyu domestically, rather than importing the finished meat at Japanese prices, was worth far more than the modest fines smugglers risked if they were caught. Investigators found the men had made the same trip at least 4 times before getting caught. Under Japanese law at the time, taking that genetic material out of the country without inspection carried a penalty of up to 3 years in prison and a fine of roughly 1 million yen, worth about $9,000, barely a third of what one legal cow already sells for at auction. So Japan rewrote the punishment. In 2020, the government amended its livestock improvement laws and passed a dedicated law protecting Wagyu genetics as a form of intellectual property, the same legal category used to guard a company's patents or trade secrets. After that change, someone caught smuggling embryos or semen wasn't just breaking an export and quarantine rule. They were stealing protected national property, with penalties written to match. That protection covers a herd of roughly 1.8 million Wagyu cattle still living inside Japan, more than 500,000 of them breeding females feeding the entire system. The United States, by comparison, holds around 40,000 Wagyu total, and fewer than 5,000 of those are full-blood animals directly descended from Japanese bloodlines, rather than crossed with Angus. That American herd has its own origin story, one that started decades before Japan ever closed its border. In 1975, a breeder named Morris Whitney imported the first 4 Wagyu bulls into the United States, 2 black and 2 red. More animals followed through the 1990s, in the same narrow window before the door shut for good. And in 1990, breeders formally organized the American Wagyu Association to track what they had. That registry still draws a hard line between a full-blood animal, descended entirely from the original Japanese genetics, and a purebred, bred up from a full-blood crossed with another breed and bred back for at least 4 generations until it reaches 15 out of 16 parts Wagyu, 93.75%. Even inside the small American side of this story, there's a hierarchy almost as strict as the one back in Japan, just built from a handful of animals that made it out before the door closed. That same incentive, the gap between what real Wagyu is worth and what it costs to fake, has quietly built an entire industry outside Japan's borders. The global Wagyu beef market was worth roughly $26.9 billion in 2025, and forecasts put it near $49 billion by 2034, with the Asia-Pacific region alone accounting for more than half of that value. Wagyu itself is simply the Japanese word for it. Wa means Japanese, Gyu means cattle, so the name never described a flavor or a farming method, just where the animal came from. That word now carries legal weight far beyond marketing. In 2015, Japan registered Kobe beef under its geographical indication system, the same kind of legal protection Europe uses for champagne or Parmesan cheese. Under that protection, no matter how closely a foreign farm copies the breeding and feeding program, its beef cannot legally be called Kobe unless it comes from Tajima-Gyu cattle raised and processed inside Hyogo Prefecture. That legal wall hasn't stopped the name from spreading everywhere else. High-end restaurants from New York to Dubai to Singapore now build entire tasting menus around a few ounces of certified A5, riding a wave of food tourism where diners plan entire trips around eating one specific cut in the region it comes from. Some restaurants import the real thing at real Japanese prices. Others use the word loosely, counting on most diners never asking which certificate, if any, their menu is actually standing on. In the United States, a retail package can legally be labeled Wagyu with as little as 46.9% Wagyu genetics, the same threshold that separates a full-blood animal from an ordinary cross, with the rest coming from ordinary Angus cattle. Restaurants have even less oversight than grocery stores. They aren't bound by that labeling rule at all, and can call almost anything Wagyu on a menu. Investigators have caught well-known steakhouses, including Old Homestead Steakhouse and Le Bernardin, serving beef advertised as Kobe that wasn't the real thing. And the restaurant chain McCormick & Schmick's settled a class action lawsuit over the same claim. Some of the fakes go further than a mislabeled cut. Lower-grade beef gets injected with fat to mimic marbling that was never grown into the muscle the slow way. A diner paying $80 for a Wagyu steak has roughly even odds of getting real Japanese genetics, or mostly Angus with a good name attached. For a shopper willing to check, that same 10-digit number stamped on the carcass back at the slaughterhouse is the way to know for certain. Type it into the official Kobe beef registry, and it either matches a real, named animal, or it doesn't. That certificate, tracing the meat back to one animal rather than just a word on a menu, is the same paperwork that started this whole story. We started with a cow worth more than a car. By now, you know why. An animal that spent 12 centuries as a farmhand before it ever became food. 3 regional bloodlines that still argue over who does it best. 3 years of patient feeding. An inspection process that turns a slice of rib into a legal identity. A genetics theft that rewrote Japanese law. And a border so tightly guarded, it built one breed into both a national treasure and one of the most faked foods on any menu. Thank you for spending this time looking closely at an animal most people only ever meet on a plate. Tell me in the comments, have you ever tasted real Japanese A5? Or was your closest brush with Wagyu the crossbred kinds? If you liked following this trail, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you there.